The wind off Lake Michigan didn't just blow, it hunted. It tore through the canyons of Chicago's Magnificent Mile like a rabid animal, stripping the warmth from anyone foolish enough to be outside. But Julian Thorne did not feel the cold. He felt only a simmering, lethal irritation. Standing beneath the heated, velvet-roped canopy of l'Orangerie, Julian checked the face of his Patek Philippe Grandmaster Chim. $200,000 of Swiss engineering told him his driver was exactly 90 seconds late. For a man who measured his life in billion-dollar microtransactions, 90 seconds was an eternity of incompetence. He smoothed the lapel of his bespoke Tom Ford suit, cream-colored cashmere, immaculate, woven to shield the Ice King from the filth of the common world. He was a statue of untouchable perfection, silhouetted against the golden glow of the restaurant's French doors. Then, the world shattered. It happened in a blur of motion from the dark, trash-strewn alley adjacent to the valet stand. Two small figures burst into the light, fleeing the biting downpour as if the darkness itself were biting at their heels. They were moving too fast to stop. The first child, a boy no older than 6, lost his footing on the slick, rain-lashed pavement. He didn't just fall, he became a projectile. He slammed into Julian's legs with the force of a desperate animal. A dilapidated wooden box, strapped to the boy's chest with twine, flew open upon impact. Disaster followed. A tin of black, viscous industrial grease used for a makeshift shoeshine hustle exploded outward. The thick, tar-like sludge splattered across the pristine cream cashmere of Julian's trousers. It was a desecration, a hideous black slash across a canvas of perfection. The silence that followed was louder than the storm. Julian recoiled, his body stiffening with a violence that made the nearby valet flinch. He looked down at the ruined fabric, then at the shivering heap of rags at his feet. The rage that surged in his chest was cold, precise, and absolute. He opened his mouth, ready to verbally flay the street urchin, ready to summon security to have this garbage disposed of. The boy scrambled up, terrified, wiping rain and grime from his face. I'm sorry, mister. I slipped. A crack of thunder shook the ground. A flash of lightning turned the night into a momentary, blinding white day, and Julian Thorne froze. The boy looked up. The light caught his eyes. They were not the muddy brown of the streets. They were not the innocent blue of the sky. They were steel, piercing, metallic, impossible gray, a genetic anomaly. A gaze that Julian saw every morning in his bathroom mirror, a gaze that had belonged to his late father. It was the Thorne gaze, cold, intelligent, and rare as a diamond in a coal mine. Time stopped. The rain seemed to hang suspended in the air. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. He wasn't looking at a stranger. He was looking at a ghost. He was looking at the photograph of himself that sat on his desk in the chaotic silence of the 90th floor. The bone structure, the defiant set of the jaw, the haunting intensity. "Leo, come on!" A second voice broke the trance. Another boy, identical to the first in every terrified detail, sprinted from the shadows to grab his brother's arm. "We gotta go, Leo! Security!" The second boy yanked his brother back, his wet, matted hair plastered to his skull. As he turned his head to check for pursuing guards, the wind whipped his hair aside. Julian's breath hitched in his throat, a strangled sound that he couldn't suppress. There, behind the second boy's left ear, was a birthmark, distinct, jagged, shaped exactly like a lightning bolt. It was the precise mirror image of the scar hidden beneath the collar of Julian's own shirt, a mark he had carried since a childhood fall. The biological probability of this moment was 0. Unless the world tilted on its axis. The grease on his pants was forgotten. The cold was forgotten. Julian Thorne, the man who feared nothing and owned everything, stood paralyzed in the rain, staring at two reflections of his own soul shivering in the gutter. The golden glow spilling from the French doors of l'orangerie carved a sharp, unforgiving line across the sidewalk. On one side lay the world of Julian Thorne, heated, scented with expensive cognac and old money, shielded from the elements. On the other side lay the gray, freezing abyss of the Chicago night, where two small boys stood shivering in the downpour. Julian remained paralyzed on the threshold, trapped between these two realities. The rain hammered against the canvas awning above, a relentless drumbeat that seemed to sync with the pounding of his own heart. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the boy Leo, those eyes, that piercing metallic steel gray. They cut through the gloom, slicing straight into the deepest, most fortified vault of Julian's memory. Suddenly, the noise of the city, the honking taxis, the distant sirens, the murmur of the valet faded into a dull hum. In the silence of his mind, a voice from 7 years ago whispered, clear and devastating, "If we ever have a son, Julian..." The memory washed over him with the force of a tidal wave. He was back in the cramped, sun-drenched dorm room he had shared with Elena Russo. She was tracing the line of his jaw with a finger that smelled faintly of sheet music and vanilla. "If we ever have a son," she had whispered, her smile radiant enough to eclipse the sun. "I hope he has your eyes, not mine, yours, so I can see the man I love every time he blinks." The memory was a physical blow. Julian blinked, and the dorm room vanished. He was back in the freezing rain, looking at the manifestation of that wish. The boy blinked. And it was indeed like looking at a mirror that reflected not just Julian's face, but his lost soul. The child was trembling violently now, the adrenaline of the collision fading into the biting cold. His lips were turning a dangerous shade of blue. Instinct took over the instinct of a man who solved every problem with a transaction. Julian reached into the inner pocket of his ruined Tom Ford jacket. His fingers, usually steady as they signed billion-dollar mergers, shook slightly as he withdrew a money clip. He peeled off a crisp, new $100 bill. Benjamin Franklin stared out, green and authoritative, a stark contrast to the grime and desperation standing before him. "Take this," Julian said, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears, hollow, strained. He extended the bill toward Leo. "Go, find a warm meal, forget the pants. Just take it." It was enough money to feed the boy for a week. It was salvation in a piece of paper. Julian expected the child to snatch it, to scramble away with the prize like any other street urchin would. But Leo didn't move. The boy stared at the bill, his steel-gray eyes widening. For a fleeting second, raw hunger flashed across his face, a primal, desperate need. But then, something extraordinary happened. The boy's jaw set. He swallowed hard, clenched his small, dirt-stained fists, and shook his head violently. "No," Leo said. The word was quiet, nearly lost in the wind, but it carried the weight of a mountain. Julian frowned, confused. "It's $100, kid. Take it." Leo took a step back, pushing Julian's hand away with a dignity that had no business existing in the gutter. "Mama says money without work is begging," the boy said, his voice trembling from the cold but steady in conviction. "We ain't beggars, mister. I messed up your pants. I gotta fix it." Before Julian could react, the boy dropped to his knees on the wet pavement. He grabbed a filthy, oil-stained rag from his broken Shoeshine box and began frantically scrubbing at the black grease smeared across Julian's cream cashmere trousers. "I can get it out," Leo stammered, rubbing harder, his small hands moving with desperate speed. "Please, mister, don't be mad. I can fix it. Mama says we always fix our mess." The rag only smeared the grease further, ruining the fabric beyond repair. But Julian didn't care about the suit. He felt as if the ground had opened up beneath him. This stubbornness, this fierce, illogical pride, this refusal to be bought. It wasn't just the eyes, it was her. The echo of the past screamed in Julian's mind. He saw the day Elena left him. He saw his mother, the matriarch of the Thorn Empire, sliding a blank check across the mahogany table. "Name your price, dear. Leave my son, and you'll never worry about tuition again." Julian remembered the sound, the sharp tearing sound of paper. Elena hadn't just refused the money. She had ripped the check into confetti, her eyes blazing with tears and fury. "My love is not a line item on your ledger," she had said. She had walked out into the winter night with nothing but her coat and her dignity, leaving Julian behind in his gilded cage. And now, here was this boy, her son. His son kneeling in the mud, refusing a handout because Mama had taught him that dignity was worth more than bread. "Stop," Julian whispered, the word choking him. He reached down, ignoring the grease, and grabbed the boy's freezing wrist. "Stop it, Leo." The touch was electric. The boy froze, looking up, fear returning to his eyes. "Leo, security's coming!" The other twin, Liam, hissed from the shadows, pointing toward the restaurant entrance, where a burly guard was stepping out, hand on his earpiece. Panic flared in Leo's eyes. The connection broke. He scrambled backward, slipping out of Julian's grip. "I'm sorry, mister," Leo cried out, grabbing his broken box. "Wait!" Julian shouted, stepping out from under the canopy, oblivious to the icy rain soaking his dress shirt. But the boys were already moving. They were fast, agile creatures of the street, darting away like frightened shadows. They splashed through the puddles, sprinting toward the dark maw of the alleyway, away from the light, away from the man who had offered them everything and nothing. At that moment, the sleek armored Maybach glided to the curb. Marcus, Julian's driver, jumped out, holding a large black umbrella. "Mr. Thorne, my apologies for the delay. The traffic was—" Marcus stopped, horrified, staring at Julian's ruined suit and the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "Sir, what happened? Get inside quickly." Julian didn't even look at the car. He didn't look at the driver. His eyes were locked on the fading silhouettes of the two small boys disappearing into the gloom. He felt a pull in his chest, a visceral, magnetic force, stronger than gravity. If he got in the car, he would go back to his penthouse, back to his empire, back to the cold, empty perfection of his life. But those gray eyes, they were the only real thing he had seen in 7 years. "Sir?" Marcus urged, opening the rear door. Julian slammed the door shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Follow them," Julian ordered, his voice low and dangerous. "Sir?" Marcus blinked, confused. "Drive after them?" "No," Julian said, stepping off the curb into the ankle-deep slush. He began to walk, his expensive Italian leather shoes sinking into the filth of the street. "We walk. If we lose them, Marcus, don't bother coming back to work tomorrow." He moved into the darkness, leaving the safety of the gold light behind. He wasn't chasing street urchins anymore. He was chasing a ghost, and he knew with terrifying certainty that whatever he found at the end of this alley would destroy the man he thought he was. The pursuit was a descent into the underworld. Julian Thorne did not run. He stalked. He moved with the singular, terrifying focus of a predator, his ruined Italian leather shoes splashing through puddles that grew deeper and darker with every block they traveled south. Behind him, Marcus, his driver and head of security, followed silently, a ghost in a black raincoat, his hand hovering near the concealed firearm at his waist. They left the Gold Coast behind that glittering electric fortress of wealth, where the skyscrapers scraped the belly of heaven. The further they walked, the more the city began to rot. The manicured sidewalks gave way to cracked concrete, where weeds burst through like desperate fingers. The white light of the financial district faded, replaced by the flickering, jaundiced glow of broken street lamps. They boarded the L train, Julian standing like a monolith in his soiled cream suit amidst tired shift workers who eyed his Patek Philippe with a mix of hunger and suspicion. When they disembarked, the air had changed. It no longer smelled of the lake and exhaust. It smelled of sulfur, wet ash, and the metallic tang of old blood. This was the Rust Belt's corpse, the industrial outskirts of the South Side. The twins led them to the very edge of civilization, where the skeleton of a closed steel mill loomed against the night sky like a dead giant. In its shadow sat the destination, the Starlight Motel. The name was a cruel joke. The neon sign buzzed with the sound of a dying insect. The letter S burned out, leaving only tarlight. It was a condemned structure repurposed into squalid, off-the-books housing for those the city had chewed up and spat out. Julian stopped in the shadows of a rusted dumpster, signaling Marcus to hold back. His heart was hammering against his ribs, not from exertion, but from a creeping, icy dread. This is where they lived. His blood? Across the cracked asphalt of the courtyard, the twins huddled under the overhang of Unit 4B. The door was peeling, the wood swollen with rot. "Count it again, Leo," the second boy, Liam, whispered, his voice carrying through the thin, damp air. Julian watched, holding his breath, as Leo dumped the contents of his pockets onto the lid of the Shoeshine box. Coins clinked, crumpled singles rustled. It was a pathetic pile of treasure. $18.50, Leo announced, his voice trembling with a mixture of cold and triumph. He looked up at his brother, his steel-gray eyes, Julian's eyes shining with pure, unadulterated relief. "We did it, Liam. We have enough." "For the pizza?" Liam asked hopefully. Leo shook his head, his expression hardening into a maturity far beyond his 6 years. "No, dummy. For Mama's breathing meds, the inhaler costs $18 at the pharmacy." Liam's shoulders slumped, but he nodded. "Okay, maybe she'll breathe quiet tonight." The word struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. $18. He had spent $5,000 on a bottle of wine at dinner just to impress a client he didn't even like. These children, his children, were celebrating a fortune of $18, not for toys, not for candy, but for medicine to keep their mother alive. A surge of protective instinct roared within him, hot and violent. But before he could step forward, the scrape of a lighter flared in the dark. "You kids locking yourselves out again?" Julian froze. A woman stood on the balcony of the adjacent unit. She was a withered scarecrow of a human, wrapped in a stained bathrobe, a cigarette dangling from her lip. "Mrs. Kowalski." Julian stepped out of the shadows. The woman jumped, dropping her lighter. Her eyes widened as she took in the tall, imposing figure in the ruined, bespoke suit. In this neighborhood, a man like Julian Thorne was either a savior or an executioner. "Where is their mother?" Julian asked. His voice was the Ice King's voice, low, frictionless, and terrifying. Mrs. Kowalski recovered quickly, her fear replaced by a sneer of disgust. She took a long drag of her cigarette and exhaled a cloud of smoke that mingled with the sulphurous rain. "That junkie?" she spat, jerking her chin toward the twins, who were now frantically trying to unlock their door. "She's inside, probably passed out. Or maybe she's already gone. Who knows with her?" Julian felt a cold clamp tighten around his chest. "Junkie?" "Oh, don't play dumb, suit man." Mrs. Kowalski laughed, a hacking, wet sound. "She calls herself Elena. Pretty name for a wreck. She locks those kids out to sleep all day, can't wake her up half the time." "She sleeps all day?" Julian repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Dead to the world," the neighbor confirmed, flicking ash onto the railing. Then she disappears every night at 2 a.m., leaves them alone, comes back when the sun comes up, smelling like a chemical fire, like a walking meth lab. She leaned over the railing, whispering conspiratorially. "You ask me, she's cooking it. That smell, it ain't natural. It smells like poison." Chemical smell, night hours, sleeping all day, neglect. The data points connected in Julian's mind with the ruthless efficiency of an algorithm. The shock and heartbreak that had brought him to this hellscape evaporated instantly. In their place, a glacier formed. He had thought she left him because she was too proud. He had thought she left him to find a man who wasn't consumed by ambition. But no. The image of the Elena he loved, the pianist with the vanilla-scented fingers, shattered. It was replaced by the image Mrs. Kowalski painted, a haggard addict, cooking meth in the dead of night, leaving his sons to beg in the rain for her fix. The Ice King returned, harder and colder than ever before. He wasn't here to save a lost love anymore. He was here to extract his assets. "Marcus," Julian said, not turning around, "secure the perimeter." He strode across the courtyard, his boots crushing the loose gravel. He didn't knock on the rotting door of Unit 4B. He prepared to kick it down. He was going to take his sons, and he was going to look Elena Russo in the eye and watch her break one last time. The door to Unit 4B did not require a key. It barely required force. Julian Thorne didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. With a single sharp kick from his ruined leather boot, the rotting wood near the jamb splintered, and the door swung inward, banging violently against the interior wall. He stepped across the threshold, ready to inhale the acrid ammonia of a meth lab, ready to confront the haze of smoke and the debris of addiction. He was prepared for a fight. He was prepared to drag his sons out of a drug den by force if necessary, but the air that hit him stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't the chemical cat piss smell of methamphetamine. It was something far worse. The room was stiflingly, oppressively hot, the radiator in the corner hissing steam like a dying snake. The atmosphere was thick, almost gelatinous, carrying a scent that triggered a primal gag reflex in the back of Julian's throat. It smelled of industrial-grade chlorine, aggressive and stinging, overlaid with the sickly, sweet, cloying odor of rotting meat. It was the smell of a hospital morgue that had been scrubbed with bleach, but couldn't quite mask the decay underneath. "Stay back," Julian commanded Marcus, his voice tight. He stepped further into the gloom. The apartment was a tomb. The wallpaper was peeling in long, damp strips like shedding skin, revealing the gray mold blooming on the plaster beneath. The ceiling leaked a steady, rhythmic drip of brown water into a plastic bucket near the center of the room. Drip, 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 a metronome, counting down the seconds of a wasted life. "Mama!" Leo's voice squeaked from behind Julian. The boys had slipped past Marcus and were scrambling toward the far corner of the room. "Mama, wake up! The bad man is here!" Julian's eyes adjusted to the dim light. There was no furniture, no chairs, no table, no television, just a single stained mattress thrown directly onto the bare floorboards in the corner, and on that mattress lay a pile of rags. "Get away from her," Julian ordered, his voice booming in the small space. The pile of rags stirred. It was a heavy, filthy quilt, gray with grime, pulled up completely to hide whatever lay beneath. From under the fabric came a sound that scraped against Julian's nerves, a wet, rattling cough. It sounded like lungs filled with fluid and broken glass. Withdrawal, Julian thought, his lip curling in disgust. She's sick from the lack of a fix. He marched across the room, his rage fueling every step. This was the woman who had claimed her dignity was not for sale. This was the woman who had torn up his mother's check. She had reduced herself to a lump of shivering flesh in a condemned motel, exposing his sons to this squalor. "Elena!" Julian roared. The figure under the quilt flinched, curling tighter into a ball. "I know it's you," Julian spat, standing over the mattress like an avenging deity. "Look at me. Have the decency to look at the man whose children you stole." A hand emerged from the quilt to wave him away, a frantic, jerky motion. But Julian didn't look at the hand closely. He was too focused on the checkbook he had pulled from his breast pocket. He ripped a check out, the sound sharp and final. "Is this what you wanted?" He threw the checkbook onto the rotting nightstand beside the bed. It landed with a heavy thud. "You want money for your next hit? Fine, I'll pay for your habit for a lifetime. But I am taking the boys. Name your price, Elena. How much to sell them to me?" The coughing fit that followed was violent, a hacking spasm that shook the entire mattress. When it subsided, a voice whispered from the darkness beneath the blanket. It was a voice that had been dragged through gravel, raspy, destroyed, barely human. "There is no Elena here." The whisper was a plea, terrified and weak. "Please leave. You have the wrong house." Julian froze. The voice was unrecognizable. It held none of the melodic, bell-like clarity of the girl he had loved in college. "Don't lie to me," he shouted, stepping closer. "Go away." The voice wheezed. "Please, don't look." Julian was about to turn, about to question if he truly had made a mistake, when his eyes landed on the nightstand where he had thrown the checkbook. There, sitting amidst a clutter of orange prescription bottles and bloody tissues, was an object that sucked the air out of the room. It was a silver music box. It was tarnished now, black with oxidation, but the shape was unmistakable. It was a tiny grand piano. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. He had bought that for her at a pawn shop during their sophomore year. He had spent his entire month's food budget on it. He had engraved the bottom himself. For the music, only you can hear. It was the only possession she had taken when she walked out. The sight of it, this relic of pure, innocent love sitting in this cesspool of chemical stench and decay, snapped the last thread of Julian's restraint. It was proof, undeniable, hateful proof. She had kept it. She had dragged their memory down into the gutter with her. "You liar," Julian hissed. The Ice King was gone. Only a man in agonizing pain remained. "You kept it. You kept the box, but you threw away the life?" He couldn't stand the quilt anymore. He couldn't stand the hiding. He needed to see the ravages of her choices. He needed to see the addict's face, the sunken eyes, the needle marks. He needed to hate her fully so he could save himself from the heartbreak. "Show me your face!" "No, Mama, no," Leo and Liam screamed, lunging for Julian's legs. Julian ignored them. He reached down, his fingers hooking into the thick, dirty fabric of the quilt. "No, Julian, don't." The voice sobbed, a sound of pure terror. With one violent motion, Julian ripped the quilt away. He expected to see a woman high on meth. He expected to see a stranger. He prepared himself to look upon a junkie. He was not prepared for what lay beneath. The dirty quilt hit the floor with a heavy, damp thud, stripping away the last layer of concealment between Julian Thorne and the truth he thought he wanted. "Look at me!" Julian commanded, his hand shooting out to seize her wrist before she could curl back into the shadows. He expected to feel the clammy, feverish skin of an addict, or perhaps the track-marked veins of a needle user. He expected the evidence of a moral failing. What he felt was the texture of a nightmare. The wrist in his grip was not smooth skin. It was rough, hard, and terrifyingly uneven. Julian froze, his eyes dropping to the hand he was holding. It was a claw. This was the hand of a piano prodigy. He remembered these fingers, long, elegant, capable of dancing across Rachmaninoff with a grace that made grown men weep. He remembered kissing these knuckles. Now the skin was raw, angry, and peeling in thick red flakes. The fingernails were gone, eaten away down to the quick, leaving behind jagged, yellowed stumps. The knuckles were swollen to twice their size, bleeding from cracks that looked like fissures in a dried-up riverbed. It wasn't a bruise. It wasn't a sore. It was an erosion. "Let go of me!" The voice screamed a dry, tearing sound. Elena yanked her arm back with a strength born of pure panic, and the momentum spun her body around. The motion forced her into the single shaft of yellow light filtering in from the hallway. Julian gasped. The sound was involuntary, a sharp intake of air that felt like swallowing broken glass. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on a loose floorboard, and slammed his back against the peeling wallpaper. "God," he breathed, the word dissolving into nothingness. Elena Russo's face, The face that had haunted his dreams for 7 years. The face he had compared every other woman to and found wanting was gone. The left side was still Elena. The high cheekbone, the pale skin, the wide, terrified eye. But the right side... The right side of her face was a map of hell. From her temple down to her jawline, the skin had been melted away. In its place was a landscape of shiny, taut red keloid scars that pulled her mouth into a permanent, grimacing rictus. Her right ear was a melted nub of cartilage. But it was her eye that broke him. The right eye was no longer brown. It was milky, white, and sightless, a clouded marble staring blindly into the abyss. It was not the ravages of methamphetamine. It was not the decay of heroin. It was a chemical burn, extensive, deep, mutilating. She looked as though someone had held her face down in a vat of fire. The smell of chlorine and rotting meat that permeated the room suddenly made sense. It wasn't a meth lab. It was the smell of necrotic tissue and strong industrial bleach used to stave off infection in a wound that never truly healed. "No," Julian whispered, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The rage that had carried him from the restaurant to this slum evaporated instantly, replaced by a nausea so violent his vision blurred. He felt bile rise in his throat. He had come here to judge a junkie. He had found a martyr, burned at the stake. Get away from her!" The scream shattered Julian's paralysis. Leo and Liam, who had been cowering in the corner, launched themselves at him. They were small, but they hit him with the ferocity of wild animals defending their wounded mother. Liam latched onto Julian's leg, sinking his teeth into the expensive cashmere. Leo pummeled Julian's thigh with his tiny fists, tears streaming down his face. "You're the bad man," Leo shrieked, his voice cracking. "She's not a junkie. She hurts. Leave her alone." "Boys, no," Elena wheezed, trying to reach for them, but she was too weak to sit up. Leo let go of Julian and scrambled onto the mattress, throwing his small body over his mother's head, spreading his arms wide to block Julian's view. Liam joined him a second later, the two identical boys forming a human shield over the broken woman. "Don't look at her," Leo sobbed, his gray eyes, Julian's eyes, blazing with hatred. "She doesn't like it when people look. You're making her cry." Julian stood trembling against the wall, stripped of his power, his wealth, and his arrogance. The scene before him was a tableau of biblical suffering. Two children dressed in rags, protecting a mother who looked like a monster, but was loved like a saint. He looked at the boys, then at the sliver of Elena's face visible beneath Leo's arm. She wasn't looking at him. She was curled into the fetal position, her forehead pressed against the dirty mattress, her shoulders shaking with dry, tearless sobs that seemed to rack her entire skeleton. "I'm sorry," Elena whispered into the bedding, her voice barely audible over the radiator's hiss. "I'm so sorry you had to see this, Julian." She wasn't apologizing for the poverty. She wasn't apologizing for the secret. She was apologizing for her ugliness. "I'm a monster," she choked out. "Please, just go back to your palace. Pretend I died. It's better that way." Julian felt a tearing in his chest, a physical pain sharper than any he had ever known. He looked at the checkbook lying on the nightstand, the money he had thrown at her to buy the children. It lay there like an obscenity. He wanted to step forward. He wanted to touch her, to tell her that he didn't care about the scars. But his feet wouldn't move. The horror was too raw, too fresh. The Ice King didn't know how to comfort a burn victim. He only knew how to break things. And standing there, in the stench of chlorine and sorrow, he realized he had broken the only thing that had ever mattered. He turned, hand over his mouth to stifle a wretch born of pure psychological shock, and stumbled toward the door, needing air, needing answers, needing to understand how the girl with the piano hands had become this creature of the dark. Julian Thorne stumbled out of Unit 4B as if he had been physically ejected by the sheer weight of the sorrow inside. He hit the cold night air of the courtyard, gasping, his lungs burning with the phantom taste of chlorine and rotting flesh. The rain was still falling, freezing and relentless, but it felt like a baptism after the stifling, toxic heat of that room. He braced his hands against the rusted railing of the walkway, retching dryly. The image of Elena's melted face was branded onto his retinas, the claw-like hand, the milky, dead eye. "Sir?" Marcus stepped forward, holding an umbrella, his face a mask of professional concern. "We need to leave. This area is unstable." "Shut up," Julian rasped, wiping rain from his eyes. He wasn't leaving, not until he understood the physics of this hell. A shadow detached itself from the gloom near the vending machine. It was a man in a graying trench coat, holding a medical bag that looked as tired as he did. He had been watching the commotion with weary, cynical eyes. This was Doc Miller, the neighborhood's unlicensed savior, the man who stitched up knife wounds and treated fevers when the hospitals demanded insurance cards that didn't exist. Julian saw the stethoscope hanging around the man's neck. He didn't think. He reacted. He crossed the cracked asphalt in 3 long strides, grabbing Miller by the lapels of his coat and slamming him against the brick wall. "You," Julian snarled, his voice trembling with a terrifying mix of rage and panic. "You're the one treating her?" Miller didn't flinch. He looked at Julian's ruined Tom Ford suit and the frantic desperation in his eyes. And he simply sighed, blowing cigarette smoke to the side. "Let go of the coat, Rockefeller. It's the only one I got." "Tell me." Julian shook him, ignoring the rain soaking his own shirt. "What is it? Meth? Heroin? Tell me what she's on so I can fix it." Miller laughed, a harsh barking sound void of humor. He pushed Julian's hands away with surprising strength. "You rich tourists are all the same. You see poverty, you think drugs. You see a scar, you think needle tracks." He stepped away, adjusting his collar, and looked toward the dark window of Unit 4B. "It ain't drugs, kid. It's the opposite. She's the cleanest soul in this godforsaken zip code." "Then what?" Julian demanded. "Her face, her lungs. Acute heavy metal poisoning, chromium toxicity. And chemical burns so deep they dissolve the dermis down to the muscle." Miller recited the diagnosis like a coroner reading an autopsy report. "Her lungs? They aren't filled with fluid. They're 70% crystallized. She inhaled enough toxic fumes to turn the lining of her chest into glass. Every breath she takes feels like swallowing a razor blade." Julian felt the blood drain from his extremities. "Crystallized? She works the graveyard shift," Miller spat, pointing a yellowed finger toward the southern horizon, where the sky glowed a sickly orange from the industrial plants. "There's a place called The Pit outside Gary, illegal chemical disposal. They don't have robots to clean the vats, rich boy. They have people, desperate people." The picture began to form, hideous and jagged. "She cleans the vats?" "Manually," Miller confirmed. "She climbs inside industrial tanks used for battery acid and heavy waste. She scrubs the sludge with a wire brush, and because protective suits cost $500 money she doesn't have, she goes in with rags wrapped around her skin." Julian swayed, the world spinning. The pianist's hands scrubbed raw by wire brushes and acid. "Why?" he whispered, the word barely a breath. "Why would she do that?" "Math," Miller said coldly. "The Pit pays $300 a night. Cash, no questions asked. It's the highest paying job for a ghost with no ID." $300? Julian stared at him. He tipped waiters more than that for pouring water. "And she doesn't keep a dime of it," Miller continued, twisting the knife. "Every morning at dawn, she meets a collector. She hands over the cash. She keeps just enough for rent and bread for the twins. She eats expired rice and prescription painkillers to numb the burns. That's it. That's her life." "A collector?" Julian asked, his mind racing. "Who is she paying?" Sharks. Russians, I think. Big debt. Miller lit another cigarette, shielding the flame from the wind. She's been doing it for 7 years, dying by inches for 7 years just to keep the wolves away. 7 years. The number hit Julian with the force of a freight train. The timeline locked into place with a sickening click. 7 years ago. Julian stood in the rain, his mind flashing back to the worst week of his life. His startup, Thorn Capital, had been hit with a frivolous but devastating intellectual property lawsuit. His assets were frozen. He was facing prison time for fraud he didn't commit. He needed $200,000 for a legal defense retainer, or he was finished. He remembered the day he was saved. His lawyer had called, ecstatic. An angel investor had appeared out of nowhere, an anonymous cash infusion, exactly $200,000. He remembered Elena breaking up with him the very next day. She had called him obsessed with money and walked out. He had hated her for it. He had used that hate to build an empire. "Doc," Julian asked, his voice sounding hollow, like a man speaking from the bottom of a well. "How much was the debt, originally?" Miller shrugged. "Word on the street? She borrowed 200 grand, but with the VIG, the interest she owes 10 times that now. She's an indentured servant. She sold her skin to pay off a loan she never spent on herself." Julian fell silent. The rain mingled with the cold sweat on his forehead. He hadn't been saved by an angel. He had been saved by a woman who walked into a loan shark's den, signed away her life, and then threw herself into a vat of acid to pay for his freedom. She had disfigured herself to build his throne. He looked at the towering, dark silhouette of the steel mill, then down at his own hands, smooth, manicured, unblemished. They were stained with invisible blood. "Marcus," Julian said. The name came out as a growl, terrifying and low. "Sir, get the car," Julian ordered, turning his back on the motel, his eyes fixed on the orange glow of the industrial district in the distance. The Ice King was dead. In his place stood a man burning with a guilt so volatile it could level cities. "We're going to Gary." The armored Maybach did not drive. It prowled, its headlights cutting through the toxic fog of Gary, Indiana, like twin lasers. The vehicle, a masterpiece of German engineering designed to withstand rocket-propelled grenades, looked alien as it crunched over the oily mud of the access road. This was the pit. It was a sprawling, illegal graveyard for chemical waste that the EPA pretended didn't exist. Rusted silos towered into the orange-hued night sky, belching steam that smelled of sulfur and death. The ground was a slurry of industrial runoff, shimmering with iridescent poisons. Julian Thorne stepped out of the car. The air here was thicker than in Chicago. It tasted like copper pennies and ash. It was the same scent that clung to Elena's hair, magnified 1,000 times. "Stay with the car," Julian ordered Marcus. He walked toward a corrugated metal shack illuminated by a single, buzzing floodlight. A man sat on a crate outside, sharpening a knife. He was a creature of the grime, his skin stained permanently gray, wearing a vest that looked stiff with grease. This was Skunk, the foreman of this circles of hell. Skunk looked up, squinting at the intruder. He didn't seem surprised. In the pit, people only arrived for 2 reasons: to dump bodies or to collect debts. "You lost, suit man?" Skunk spat a stream of tobacco juice near Julian's ruined leather boots. Julian didn't blink. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick envelope. He tossed it onto the crate. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. $5,000 in cash. "Information," Julian said, his voice cutting through the hiss of the steam pipes, "about a woman, Elena." Skunk paused, eyeing the envelope. He snatched it up, thumbing the bills with a greedy grin. Then he laughed a wheezing smoker's rattle. "Elena, you mean Chemical E?" Skunk shook his head, a twisted sort of respect darkening his eyes. "Yeah, I know her. Toughest broad I ever saw. Crazy, though. Got a death wish." "The burns," Julian said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "How did it happen?" Skunk pointed a jagged fingernail toward a massive looming vat in the distance, wrapped in caution tape that had long since rotted away. 3 years ago, Tank 4, pressure valve blew, Skunk recounted, his voice devoid of pity. It was spewing pressurized acid, hot enough to melt bone. Every other guy on the crew ran. They scrambled like rats. He looked Julian in the eye. But not her. She didn't run. She screamed something about her kids, and then she jumped. She threw her body right onto the breach. She hugged the death, man. She held that seal closed with her own flesh until we could cut the main line. Saved the whole crew. Saved the tank from going up like a nuke. Julian felt the bile rise in his throat. He closed his eyes, and for a second, he saw it. Elena, his Elena, throwing herself onto a geyser of acid to save a few dollars, to stay alive for one more day for the twins. "Why?" Julian whispered. "Debt." Skunk shrugged, counting the money again. "She owes the Vipers. Russian outfit, nasty pieces of work. She borrowed 200 grand 7 years ago. But the VIG, the interest is killer. She owes him 1.5 million now. She works here every night just to pay the interest. She ain't ever paying off the principal. She's a slave, suit man. Until she dies. $200,000, 7 years ago. The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place with the violence of a gunshot. Julian turned away from Skunk, walking blindly toward the edge of the lot where the shadows were deepest. He pulled his phone from his pocket. His fingers, usually so precise, fumbled as he dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Harrison, his old corporate attorney, the man who had handled the lawsuit that almost destroyed Thorn Capital in its infancy. "Julian?" Harrison's voice was groggy, confused. "It's midnight. What's going on?" "The angel investor," Julian said, his voice trembling with a terrifying quietness. 7 years ago, the lawsuit, the $200,000 cash that saved me from prison. Where did it come from?" "Julian, we've been over this," Harrison stammered, instantly awake. "It was anonymous. A trust." "Don't lie to me, Harrison," Julian roared into the phone, the sound echoing off the rusted silos. "I am standing in a toxic waste dump in Gary, Indiana. I know everything. If you lie to me one more time, I will bury you under this mud." Silence stretched on the line, heavy and guilty. "It was her," Harrison finally whispered, his voice cracking. "It was Elena." Julian felt his knees buckle. He grabbed a cold, wet pipe to hold himself up. "She came to my office that morning," Harrison confessed, the words spilling out fast. "She had a duffel bag, dirty cash, rubber bands. It smelled like smoke. She begged me to take it. She told me to list it as an anonymous investment. She said if you knew she got it from loan sharks, you'd never take it. You'd go to prison rather than let her owe that debt." "And the breakup?" Julian asked, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "She left me the next day." "She had to, Julian," Harrison said softly. "The Russians told her that if she missed a payment, they'd come for her collateral. She was afraid the collateral would be you. She broke your heart to save your life." Julian dropped the phone. It hit the mud, screen up, glowing in the darkness. He sank to his knees. The industrial grit soaked into his trousers. The stench of the pit filled his lungs. He had built a billion-dollar empire on the belief that he was a self-made genius who had risen above a woman who didn't believe in him. He had spent 7 years hating her, polishing his ego, while she was here in this hell-scrubbing vats and melting her own skin to pay for the suit on his back. He wasn't a king. He was a parasite. And tonight, the host was dying. The mud of the industrial wasteland seeped through the knees of Julian Thorne's trousers, cold and viscous, staining the cream cashmere with the filth of Gary, Indiana. But Julian didn't feel the cold anymore. He didn't feel the rain that continued to hammer against his back. He felt only the crushing weight of a fraudulent existence. For 7 years, Julian had walked the earth as a titan. He had graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune, styled as the Ice King, the self-made prodigy who had turned a near bankruptcy into a billion-dollar venture capital empire. He had believed his own myth. He had believed that his genius, his resilience, and his sheer will had saved him from the precipice of ruin. He stared down at his hands, illuminated by the harsh, buzzing floodlight of the foreman's shack. They were shaking violently. They weren't the hands of a king. They were the hands of a thief. Every dollar he owned, every skyscraper he bought, every bottle of wine he uncorked, it was all blood money. It was all purchased with the melted skin of the woman he had spent 7 years hating. A guttural sound ripped from his throat, a sound so raw and animalistic that even Skunk, the hardened foreman, took a step back into the shadows. Julian slammed his fist into the oily slurry of the ground. Splash! He hit the earth again and again, punishing himself, shattering the composure that had been his armor. The montage of the last 7 years played in his mind, not as a highlight reel of success, but as a horror movie of contrast. While he was sleeping on 1,000 thread count Egyptian cotton sheets in his penthouse, Elena was curling up on a dirty mattress, shivering from chemical exposure. While he was flying first class to Tokyo to close a deal, she was climbing into a vat of battery acid, wrapping rags around her face, praying the fumes wouldn't kill the only mother his sons had. While he was sneering at her memory, telling himself she was a weak, money-hungry coward who abandoned him when times got hard, she was literally selling pieces of her body to keep the Russian mob from killing him. "She broke your heart to save your life." The lawyer's voice echoed in his head, a ghost that would never be silenced. He remembered the day she left, the look in her eyes. He had thought it was indifference. Now, with the lens of truth, he realized it was terror. She had looked at him like a dying soldier looking at the home they were defending. She had taken the hatred, the insults, and the scorn, and she had swallowed it all just to ensure he remained the collateral she wouldn't let them touch. Julian grabbed the lapels of his suit jacket, the suit that cost more than Elena made in a year, and tore it open. Buttons popped, scattering into the mud like worthless pearls. He felt like he was suffocating inside his own skin. He wanted to tear off the flesh that had been preserved at the cost of hers. The Ice King died in that parking lot. The cold, calculating detachment that had defined Julian Thorne for nearly a decade dissolved, melted by a volcanic eruption of guilt and fury. He wiped the mud from his face, streaking the grime across his cheek like war paint. He stood up. He didn't rise as a businessman. He rose as something ancient and terrifying. He wasn't thinking about stock prices or PR strategies. He was thinking about fire. He was thinking about the vipers. He was thinking about the debt. He turned toward the armored Maybach. Marcus was standing by the open door, his face pale, holding a satellite phone against his ear. The security chief's usual stoicism was gone, replaced by urgent alarm. "Mr. Thorne!" Marcus shouted over the roar of the steam pipes. Julian walked toward him, his stride eating up the distance. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a weapon. "What is it?" Julian's voice was unrecognizable, a low, grinding growl that vibrated in the chest. Marcus lowered the phone, his eyes wide. "It's the surveillance team we left at the motel. They just radioed in." Julian stopped, his heart skipping a beat. "Report." "The Vipers," Marcus said, the name hanging in the toxic air. "They're at the Starlight. They say Elena missed her interest payment this morning. They're not waiting for the money, sir." Julian's blood turned to ice, then instantly boiled. "The boys?" "The leader, a guy named Volkov. He says he's taking the collateral," Marcus relayed, his voice tightening. "He's kicking in the door right now." The world narrowed down to a single point of focus. The red haze of rage that had been building in Julian's gut exploded. "Give me the keys," Julian commanded, shoving Marcus aside. "Sir, I'll drive. You're in no condition." "I said give me the keys," Julian roared, snatching the fob from Marcus's hand. He didn't wait for his security chief. He threw himself into the driver's seat of the Maybach. He slammed the door and punched the ignition. The V12 engine roared to life, a beast waking up. Julian gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes dead and cold. They were touching his sons. They were hurting his wife. He slammed the car into gear. The tires spun, spraying mud and gravel as the heavy vehicle fishtailed onto the access road. He didn't care about the speed limit. He didn't care about the laws of physics. He was coming for them. And he wasn't bringing a checkbook. He was bringing the apocalypse. The Starlight Motel had descended into chaos. The freezing rain that had plagued the night was now whipping sideways, driven by a gale that screamed through the rusted walkways. But the weather was the least of the violence tearing apart the courtyard of Unit 4B. "Please, no, take me!" Elena Russo's voice was a shredded ribbon of sound. She was crawling through the blackened slush of the parking lot, her fingernails already ruined from the acid vats, clawing desperately at the muddy asphalt. Her body, weakened by years of poison and starvation, was failing her, but her mother's instinct drove her forward. Ahead of her, a nightmare unfolded. Two men, thick-necked and clad in heavy leather jackets, were dragging Leo and Liam toward a waiting black van. The boys were kicking and screaming, their small boots slipping on the wet ground. "Let go of my brother!" Leo shrieked, sinking his teeth into the hand of the man holding him. "You little rat!" The man, a scarred brute named Volkov, backhanded the 6-year-old. The sound of the slap cracked through the air, louder than the thunder. Leo crumpled, dazed, hanging limp in the thug's grip. "No!" Elena screamed, lunging for Volkov's ankle. "He's just a baby. Take me. I'm the debt." Volkov looked down, his eyes dead and cruel. He didn't see a mother. He saw a ledger entry that was overdue. He raised a heavy boot and kicked Elena hard in the ribs. She collapsed into the mud, gasping for air that wouldn't come, curling around her agonizingly crystallized lungs. "You are used goods, Elena," Volkov spat. "The boys are fresh collateral. They will work off your interest in the warehouse." He turned to throw Leo into the van. That was when the world exploded. There was no screech of brakes, only the roar of a V12 engine pushed to its mechanical limit. Twin beams of blinding white light cut through the rain like the gaze of God. The armored Maybach didn't stop at the gate. It hit the chain-link fence at 60 miles per hour. Metal shrieked and tore as the heavy luxury vehicle plowed through the barrier, turning steel posts into shrapnel. The car launched into the courtyard, skidding sideways through the mud, crushing two of the mobsters' motorcycles under its multi-ton chassis before slamming to a halt 10 feet from Volkov. Silence reigned for a split second, the shock of pure, unbridled kinetic energy. The driver's door flew open. Julian Thorne stepped out. He was no longer the impeccable billionaire who had stood under the awning of l'orangerie. His cream suit was torn open, stained brown with the filth of the pit. His hair was wild, plastered to his skull by the rain. In his hand, he didn't hold a pen or a phone. He gripped a heavy, rusted tire iron he had snatched from the trunk of the car in a frenzy. He didn't speak. He didn't negotiate. He moved with the terrifying, silent velocity of a reaper. "Who the hell are?" Volkov started, reaching for the gun in his waistband. He never finished the sentence. Julian swung the tire iron with a force that shuddered through his entire body. The metal bar connected with Volkov's forearm, the arm reaching for the weapon. A sickening crack echoed across the courtyard. Volkov screamed, dropping Leo as he clutched his shattered limb. Julian didn't stop. He stepped over the screaming man, spinning to face the second thug holding Liam. The man froze, seeing the look in Julian's eyes. It wasn't the look of a businessman. It was the look of a man who had already died inside and had nothing left to lose. "Let him go," Julian whispered. The sound was more terrifying than a shout. The thug hesitated. That hesitation cost him. Julian swung the tire iron again, smashing the man's kneecap. The thug went down like a sack of stones, releasing Liam. "Daddy!" Liam cried, scrambling backward into the mud. Julian stood over his sons, breathing hard, the tire iron dripping with rain and violence. His security team, led by Marcus, swarmed through the broken fence behind him, assault rifles raised, their laser sights painting red dots on the chests of the remaining Vipers. But Julian didn't need them. He turned back to Volkov, who was writhing on the ground. Julian reached into the back seat of the Maybach and hauled out a heavy black duffel bag. He walked over to the mob boss and threw the bag down. It hit Volkov's chest with a heavy, dull thud. "Open it," Julian commanded. Volkov, wheezing through the pain, unzipped the bag with his good hand. Inside, stacks of $100 bills were packed tight. $3 million in cash emergency liquidity Julian kept in the car for hostile takeovers. "That is $3 million, Julian said, his voice cold and flat. "That pays her principal. That pays her interest. That buys this entire motel." He leaned down, grabbing Volkov by the collar, pulling the man's face close to his own. Julian's eyes, the steel-gray thorn eyes, burned with a nuclear intensity. "And here is the rest of the deal," Julian hissed. "If I ever see a single member of your organization in Chicago again, if I ever see you look at my family, I will not call the police. I will use my fortune to buy your organization. I will buy your suppliers. I will buy your debts, and I will dismantle you, bone by bone, until you are nothing but a memory. Do you understand?" Volkov nodded frantically, terror eclipsing the pain. "Go." The mobsters scrambled, dragging their injured comrades, abandoning the van, fleeing into the night like roaches scattering under a kitchen light. Julian dropped the tire iron. It clangered against the pavement. The red rage drained out of him, leaving only a trembling, crushing grief. He turned. Elena was still lying in the mud, trying to push herself up, coughing blood. She saw him approaching and instinctively pulled the collar of her rags up to hide the melted right side of her face. "Don't," she wheezed, turning her head away. Shame radiating from her broken body. "Don't look at me, Julian. I'm sorry." Julian fell to his knees in the slush beside her. He didn't care about the mud ruining the last of his suit. He reached out, his hands shaking, and gently pulled her hands away from her face. He looked at the scars. He looked at the milky eye. He looked at the ruin she had endured to save him. "Elena," he choked out, tears finally spilling over, mixing with the rain on his cheeks. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, ignoring the smell of sickness, ignoring the disfigurement. He grabbed her ruined, claw-like hands and pressed them to his lips, kissing the raw knuckles, the missing fingernails, the evidence of her sacrifice. "I'm here," he sobbed, his voice breaking into 1,000 pieces. "I know everything. I know about the lawyer. I know about the debt. I know what you did." Elena stilled, her single good eye widening in shock. You know?" "I know I'm not the king," Julian whispered, pulling her fragile body into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. "You are. You always were. And I am never letting you go again." The air in Big Sur did not smell of sulfur, chlorine, or impending death. It smelled of wild sage, salt spray, and the crisp, ancient scent of redwood trees, baking in the California sun. 18 months had passed since the night the Ice King had knelt in the mud of a Chicago slum. Julian Thorne stood on the limestone terrace of his private estate, perched precariously on a cliff edge overlooking the churning azure of the Pacific Ocean. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore a simple white linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up, the top button undone. He looked younger, the harsh lines of perpetual calculation around his eyes smoothed away by a piece he had purchased with something far more valuable than money: penance. He watched the woman at the piano. Elena Russo sat at a white Steinway Grand, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon. She was playing Debussy's Clair de Lune. The notes drifted out over the ocean, delicate and haunting, mixing with the rhythm of the crashing waves below. Julian's eyes traced the movement of her hands. 18 months ago, they had been eroded claws, eaten by acid and labor. Now, after months of agonizing reconstructive surgery in Zurich, after skin grafts and hyperbaric oxygen therapy, they were hands again. They were scarred web networks of faint, silvery lines traced across her knuckles like lace gloves, but they were strong. They danced across the ivory keys with a dexterity that defied medical explanation, fueled by a soul that refused to be silenced. He looked at her face. The best plastic surgeons in the world had done their work, but they hadn't erased the past. They hadn't tried to. The deep, melted ruin of her right side was gone, replaced by smooth, grafted skin. But the scars were still there, thin, pale tracers running from her temple to her jaw. Her right eye, though no longer clouded and blind thanks to a corneal transplant, held a depth of wisdom that the left did not. She wasn't the flawless girl from the college photos. She was something more breathtaking. She was a mosaic. She was a testament to survival. Julian closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. Remembering the long nights in the Swiss clinic, he remembered sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair for weeks, refusing to leave her side, holding her bandaged hand while she screamed through the nerve regeneration pain. He remembered the day she took her first full breath without the oxygen tank, her crystallized lungs finally healing enough to inhale the world again. "Dad, look at us!" The shout broke his reverie. Julian turned to see two missiles in miniature tuxedos sprinting across the patio. Leo and Liam were 7 now. The hollow cheeks of malnutrition were gone, replaced by the rosy flush of health and days spent running on the beach. Their steel gray eyes, the thorn gaze, no longer held the terrified wariness of street urchins. They shone with mischief and security. "We look like penguins!" Liam giggled, spinning around to show off his tails. "You look like gentlemen," Julian corrected, sweeping both boys up into his arms. He kissed their heads, smelling shampoo and ocean air instead of industrial grease. "Is Mom ready?" "She's playing our song," Leo whispered, pointing to the piano. Elena finished the final chord, letting the note hang in the salty air. She turned on the bench. When she saw Julian holding their sons, her smile broke across her face. It was radiant. She didn't turn her bad side away anymore. She lifted her chin, letting the sun catch the silver lines of her scars. "You're late for your own wedding, Mr. Thorne," she teased, her voice raspy but warm, the gravel of the chemical burns having softened into a smoky contralto. "I was just admiring the view," Julian replied, setting the boys down. There were no guests, no press. No paparazzi helicopters circling overhead. The billions in the Thorne bank account could have bought a royal wedding, but they chose this, just the 4 of them, the ocean and the truth. Julian walked to the piano. He dropped to one knee. He didn't reach for a velvet box from Cartier or Tiffany's. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an object that looked out of place amidst the coastal luxury. It was the silver music box. He had spent months restoring it himself. He had polished the tarnish until it gleamed like moonlight. He had replaced the broken internal gears with microscopic precision. He placed it on the piano bench. With a trembling finger, he lifted the lid. The tiny mechanism began to tink, a clumsy mechanical version of the song she had just played. Nestled inside, where the ballerina used to be, was a ring. It wasn't a diamond the size of a skating rink. It was a simple band of platinum, inlaid with a single, rough-cut gray stone. "I thought about buying you the Hope Diamond," Julian said softly, his voice thick with emotion, but it felt cold. Elena reached out, her scarred fingers hovering over the box. "Julian, 7 years ago I thought I was the diamond," Julian said, looking up at her, his soul naked in his eyes. I thought I was the hard, brilliant thing that the world couldn't break, but I was wrong. I was just a stone, Elena. I was dull and common." He took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly over the faint scar on her ring knuckle. "You," he whispered. "You took the pressure. You took the heat. You took the acid and the rust and the weight of the whole world. You are the diamond. You always were." Elena wept. Not the dry, painful sobs of the motel room, but tears of pure, cleansing joy. She pulled him up and he kissed her, not carefully, but desperately, kissing the scars, kissing the history, claiming every jagged piece of her as his own. "I love you," she breathed against his lips. "I worship you," he vowed. Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, setting the Pacific on fire with hues of violet and gold, Julian stood by the railing, one arm around Elena, the other resting on the heads of his sons. "Tomorrow," Julian said quietly, "we announce the Russo Foundation." "The debt relief program?" Elena asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Yes. We're going to buy the debt of every family in the Rust Belt trapped by predatory loans. We're going to bankrupt the loan sharks by paying off their victims. No one will ever have to step into a vat of acid to save their family again. Not while I have a breath in my body." Elena smiled, turning her face toward the dying light. The sunset hit her scars, turning the silver lines into gold. She didn't look damaged. She looked like a piece of Japanese kintsugi pottery broken, but put back together with gold, making her more beautiful and valuable than she had ever been before. She was the diamond in the rust, polished by pain, shining eternal. "Play it again, Mama," Leo asked, tugging her hand. And as the stars began to emerge over the vast, dark ocean, the music started again, a symphony of second chances echoing into the night. The diamond in the rust shatters the illusion that wealth equals worth. Julian Thorne believed he was a self-made king, only to discover his crown was bought with the flesh and blood of the woman he scorned. This story is a brutal reminder that true love isn't found in grand gestures or perfect appearances, but in the quiet, agonizing sacrifices made in the dark. It teaches us that scars are not defects, they are the gold filling our cracks, proving that the most beautiful souls are often the ones that have walked through fire and refused to burn. Now, if you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know which part surprised you the most. Every subscription and comment from you is a huge motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful stories in life. Thank you so much.